There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from loving somebody who can oftentimes make you feel like you're losing your mind. And if you have ADHD, you probably know the one I'm talking about. You'll go over the conversation 100 times in your head. You know what happened, you know what was said, and somehow you end up being the one who apologizes still. And the worst part, it happens again with the next person. And here's what I want you to know. What I want you to really hear, this isn't a coincidence. It's not, bad taste in people. It's definitely not bad luck. It is your brain doing a very specific thing. And once you understand what it is, I don't think you're going to be able to unsee it. Before I go any further, let me introduce myself. My name is Adam. I'm an ADHD consultant. I'm finishing my master's in psychology. I have ADHD combined type, which means I'm not explaining your experience from the outside looking in. I've lived these versions of everything we're about to talk about. Whether you're watching this for yourself or maybe it's, for somebody you love who keeps kind of landing in these same dynamics. Either way, I'm glad you're here. Quick thing I want to name before we get into this. Most of us watching are not in a relationship with a clinical narcissist. This is a real diagnosable personality disorder. And to be honest with you, it's a lot more rare than the internet kind of makes it sound. Controlling relationships, emotionally volatile ones, relationships where you end up smaller than when you started, where you're more anxious than maybe loved or more confused than even connected. Those are everywhere. A narcissist sits at the extreme end of the spectrum. I'm probably going to use that word today because it kind of captures the pattern more clearly and a bit more sharply. But everything we're about to talk about, it runs across a much wider range of dynamics than that one word implies. This isn't a video about diagnosing your ex or your last relationship or even the one you're in. This is more of a gut check. You could think of it as a map or a way to understand what our brains have been doing so that in the future we can make a different choice. All right, so let's start with the thing most of us with ADHD don't know we have. And this is called Rejection Sensitive Dysphoria. RSD, it's also known as that. Here's the first thing you should know about it. The word dysphoria, it comes from a Greek word it means unbearable, not uncomfortable or painful. This is unbearable. That wasn't by accident. The term was coined by Dr. William Dodson. He was a board certified psychiatrist. He spent decades specializing in adult ADHD. And here's what he found. Research shows that emotional dysregulation can show up in up to 70% of adults with ADHD. And peer-reviewed literature tells us this. It tells us more than 2/3 actually. But Dodson actually went further. In his clinical work, he had thousands of patients, and he observed that the specific rejection kind of flavored version of emotional dysregulation, he called it RSD in it. He said it showed up roughly in 98 to 99% of ADHD patients. Now keep in mind, that was his clinical observation. It wasn't a controlled trial or anything like that. It's been documented in case series and confirmed by many independent clinicians worldwide, which means statistically, if you have ADHD, there's a really good chance you probably deal with RSD also. Now, RSD, it gets triggered by the perception, not by the reality of things. And that's something we have to really focus on. It's perception of being rejected, criticized, or falling short of somebody's expectations. It hits instantaneous. It's not a buildup. It's just 0 to 100, no ramp up, no warning. It's just goes to complete emotional devastation. It feels like a fraction of a second. If somebody cancels plans, feels devastating. We send something out to a friend and they don't text back. Devastating. Maybe our partner uses a flat tone and no expression. Devastating. Here's what I really want to land. This isn't dramatic. This isn't being too sensitive like we've been labeled before. Dr. Dodson actually describes the pain of RSD as a wound that's completely out of proportion to the trigger. And one third of his patients said RSD was the single most impairing part of their entire experience with ADHD. That's huge. Not the inattentive part, not the executive dysfunction. It was the rejection pain. We got to let that sit for a second. Most conversations about RSD and what they completely skip over, it doesn't just fire when somebody else rejects us. It fires really hard sometimes, even harder a lot of times when we reject ourselves. Most of the conversation around RSD is about other people. Maybe somebody didn't respond, a partner went cold, boss criticized us. The trigger, it doesn't need to always come from the outside. We could set a goal and miss it. We slip back into a habit we swore we were going to be done with. Maybe we forget something important again. We look at our to-do list at 9 p.m. and we did none of it. For an ADHD brain with RSD, these moments don't just feel like a setback. This can be confirmation that we are fundamentally not enough. That every person who ever told us we were too much or too scattered, too broken, they were right. Maybe they were right. It's that same neurological spike. It's the same devastation that comes along with it. It's just pointed inward instead of pointed outward towards maybe who said it to us. And this is the piece that nobody talks about when they connect ADHD to toxic relationships. Because, a harmful partner, they don't always have to attack us directly. They really just have to be present when we attack ourselves. They learn our rhythm. They'll notice that when we fall short or when we fail at something, when we'll spiral in shame, we're at our most open at that times, most desperate for reassurance, right? We're most willing to accept whatever version of them is willing to be put out there for us. Even if the person offering the comfort is part of the reason that we feel this way. And if you're watching this as a parent, I think this might be the piece you've been watching from the outside without always having the words for it. Many times your person struggles. They go to the partner for comfort and somehow they always come out of it apologizing for that. This isn't weakness. It's a neurological loop that has a very specific name, and we're going to break down every piece of it here. So what does it actually look like in a real relationship? I want to be real careful here because these dynamics, they show up across a real wide range of situations. Some relationships are genuinely harmful. Some are two people with their own wounds constantly activating each other. Some are just two people who care about each other but don't know how to communicate. What I'm describing today, this shows up most sharply at the more harmful end of things. It's the controlling dynamics, emotionally manipulative situations. Places where one person's sense of self comes constantly at the other person's expense. A narcissist is kind of the clearest version of this pattern. It's not the only version. Keep that in mind. So what happens when an ADHD brain ends up in one of these dynamics with RSD? Three things become almost automatic. One, we apologize constantly, even when we're not sure what we did wrong, because the possibility that they're upset, that might be more unbearable than the uncertainty of being right for ourselves. And when we did mess something up, the apologize from us is enormous, disproportionately enormous to what we did. And then the relief we get when it's accepted, that hit of dopamine, being okay again, it trains us to keep doing it. It trains us to keep looking for that dopamine to be okay again, that up and down, that roller coaster ride. Two, we seek reassurance constantly. We need to know things are okay, which means we will keep going back to the person who controls how we feel, even when that person is the source of our instability. Three, we will overlook things because we're in survival mode, in an RSD spiral. The familiar feels safer than unknowingly walking away, even when the familiar hurts. And there's research that backs this up. A study in the Journal of Attention Disorders found that adults with ADHD report significantly higher rates of psychological partner conflict than neurotypical adults on both sides of the dynamic. Both sides. That's really important because it tells us these relationships spiral. Both people end up feeling like the victim. Often people are right. Here's the gut check for this section. Not whether we've done any of these things. Most people have. The question is whether these patterns got bigger over time. Did they escalate or did they get smaller? Now let me pause for a second and say something very directly. Understanding why our brains make us vulnerable does not make the other person entirely responsible for the situation that's driven by RSD behavior. It's not. The constant need for reassurance, the reactivity, handing somebody else the controls of our internal emotional state. Those things affect our partners too. They affect the relationship. Understanding the mechanism explains the pattern, but it doesn't excuse it for either person. The work isn't figuring out who is the real victim. The work is understanding what we bring into the relationship so we can bring something different next time. Let's add the next layer, because RSD alone, it still doesn't explain the picture in its entirety. We also have to talk about dopamine. And let me clear something up about this now. ADHD it's not simply having less dopamine. That's a big part of it, but it's not just that. The current scientific understanding backed by PET imaging research published in JAMA, JAMA, is that ADHD involves a dysregulation of the dopamine reward system, reduced availability of dopamine receptors and transporters in that reward pathway. Now, what that means in real life is our brains are constantly searching for dopamine. We don't get like the steady kind of IV background drip or hum of a reward that a neurotypical brain gets just from existing in life and kind of doing normal things. Our ADHD brains, we need intensity to feel like we're actually alive, So what does the beginning of an intense relationship look like? Especially at the more problematic end of the spectrum. It can be called love bombing, constant attention, constant validation. You feel more seen maybe than you probably ever have by this person. This person might think you're extraordinary, completely and, unreservedly just amazing. And for dopamine seeking ADHD brains, this isn't like flattering and just butterfly. This is neurochemically fucking overwhelming. And here's the wild part that, this isn't just like a metaphor. In 2005, anthropologist Helen Fisher, she published a landmark fMRI study showing that early stage romantic love activates the exact same dopamine-rich regions as drug use does. That's crazy, right? It explains a lot too. Harvard Medical School summarized it pretty plainly. Dopamine during early love creates euphoria similar to cocaine or alcohol. That is actual neuroscience, guys. So our brains already running on a reward deficit, already hungry for this intensity, absolutely flooded by love. And that's why it hooks us the way it does. Like this isn't a weakness inside of us. This is neurochemistry. Now, love bombing happens in relationships that turn out to be completely healthy too. Love bombing isn't all bad. Intensity early on, it's not an automatic red flag for the relationship. Question is always, what follows that? Does the warmth become consistent or does it become unpredictable? Because unpredictable for our ADHD brains, this is where it gets genuinely dangerous for our brains. One more ingredient, and I gotta be honest, this one is a little uncomfortable to sit with, but ADHD brains have higher novelty-seeking behavior. The same dopamine system, the same hunger for a new stimulation, new conversations, new intensity, new everything. Early in a relationship, every interaction is new. Our brains are like fully engaged. We feel like genuinely alive in a way that just existing every day in this routine, it doesn't always produce for us. But then something happens in certain relationships. That warmth can become really inconsistent, hot one day, kind of cold the next day. Present can become completely withdrawn. And here's where it gets genuinely strange is that unpredictability for our specific brains can actually deepen our attachment. Instead of weakening it and pushing us away, it actually drives us towards it. This is foundational behavior science going back to B.F. Skinner. When rewards are unpredictable, you'll work harder to get them than when they're guaranteed. Your brain doesn't disengage. It literally doubles down. It becomes obsessed with figuring out the pattern. It's literally the same mechanism that makes slot machines addictive and gambling addictive. You don't know when the next reward is coming. So you keep pulling the lever. And in relationships, when the warmth finally comes back, after this period of coldness, the relief is so intense that that reinforces the entire cycle. in our brains, they don't read this as like a dysfunction. Our brains read this as a reward worth pursuing again. And this is not proof that someone's like a narcissist. This can show up in anxious attachment in two people who both have wounds and they keep accidentally activating them. But if we constantly feel most bonded right after we've felt the most hurt, that might be worth sitting with. Now, let's talk about the piece that tends to hit the hardest in the most harmful relationships, and this is memory. ADHD significantly impairs our working memory, the system responsible for holding and accurately recalling the details of what actually happened in a conversation. So what was said, what was the tone, what really occurred. This is one of the most replicated findings in ADHD neuroscience. Multiple meta-analysis, actually. Adults with ADHD perform significantly worse on verbal and episodic memory tasks than a neurotypical adult. What this means is when somebody tells us that never happened, or you're remembering it wrong, or you're being too sensitive, we already have a built-in tendency to defer because we've spent like our entire lives being told we're too much, we're too forgetful, we're too dramatic, we're too reactive. So when our partner says it, it doesn't just land. It literally lands in a soil that's been like prepared and fertilized for it for our entire lives. And when self-directed RSD is also firing at the same time, when we're already in a shame spiral from our own failures, the doubt about our own perception can go really deep, really fast. This isn't a character flaw for us. This is a documented cognitive vulnerability. And in certain relationships, it gets used. The question to sit with here isn't, did my partner gaslight me? The question is, have I consistently trusted their version of events over my own? Have I constantly felt confused about what I actually remember? That pattern, wherever it came from, is completely worth examining. Let me paint you two pictures, right? So scenario one, something goes sideways in the relationship. We react. The conversation somehow, I don't even know how, ends up with us apologizing. They accept it, and then we feel relief from that. Scenario two, we mess something up ourselves. We know we did it. We're already in a shame spiral before they have to say a single word about it. So we over apologize, we overcompensate, and when they accept it, even a little coldly, we feel grateful. Either direction, we've been trained. We're essentially managing the emotional temperature is like our job in the relationship. And apologizing ends up kind of being the tool we use to do it. Now, this pattern can develop with a genuinely harmful person, but it can also develop between two completely great people who just have wounds and don't know how to communicate with each other. The pattern alone, we have to know, it doesn't tell us everything about who that person is, but it tells us a lot about what we have been trained to do. What do we actually do with it? First thing is we should use this as an inventory, not like an indictment, not of them, not of ourselves. This is purely data. This is information for us to use. The clearest map we've ever had of this particular terrain, actually. And here's what research and clinical experience actually support. So one, learn to catch your RSD in real time. When we feel the spike, whether it's coming from them or it's coming from ourselves, that is a cue to pause. We cannot suppress the emotion. But what we can do is we can recognize it as a neurological event happening, not like a verdict of our worth, not proof of who they are either. Specific therapy approaches designed for the overlap of ADHD and trauma are genuinely worth looking into. EMDR, so eye movement desensitization reprocessing. This is recognized by the World Health Organization and the American Psychiatric Association as a gold standard for treatment for trauma. And for those of us where RSD and relationship history are kind of tangled together, clinicians who specialize in this intersection they're increasingly using it super effectively. DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, is another one. This one has specific structured skills built for emotional dysphoria. Not like generic talk therapy. It's tools designed for exactly this, this kind of emotional intensity. 3, this one is one I want you to actually listen. I want you to actually hear this one. Our patterns are not random. They're also not permanent. If we look back at relationship history and we keep seeing the same things, this is data about what our nervous system has learned to seek out. And the beautiful neuroscience backed truth of this is that nervous systems can learn something totally different. So, whether you're watching this for yourself or maybe for somebody you love who might keep ending up in these dynamics, I really hope this gave you something useful to work with. Not to, definitely not to label anyone. Not a verdict on your past or anybody else's past relationships. More just a clear picture of what our brains have been doing and why certain patterns have been so hard to see from inside of the pattern. We're not broken. We're not cursed. We have a very specific neurological profile that, without awareness, can make certain dynamics very easy to fall into and very hard to climb out of. Before you go, I want to make sure you hit that subscribe button so that every time I post a video, you know about it and I can give you the ADHD help you need. So make sure you hit the like, make sure you hit the subscribe, and make sure you leave a comment because I want to know what you want to know about. Other than that, y'all, have an amazing week.